I start with the thing that I have already said so many times. This is different and I don't like it. In my head right now, I can hear the brass. I can feel the energy of the congregation singing all together. I can see in my mind's eye kids tearing after Easter eggs, not caring at all about getting dirty the beautiful clothes their parents dressed them in. Especially since we were going to be in our own sanctuary to celebrate the resurrection as we continue to recover from the fire, I have been more than a little bitter this week about all the ways this Easter would be different, and in my mind, less than I wanted it to be. The truth is, though, that the first Easter was really more like today than it is a usual Easter Sunday for us. There were no trumpets or organs, no one dressed in their finest pastels, no eggs to hunt, no brunch to have. In fact, it was very quiet and very early in the morning, and the people were not gathered. In fact, most of the people were literally locked in their homes and afraid. It was only the women who went down to the tomb that morning, and it wasn't to rejoice and sing, it was to grieve what they had lost. They didn't go that morning with high hopes, but with the first century equivalent of embalming fluid. I know that the quiet and the separation of this Easter is hard. I read something this week that talked about how what we're really in is this very long Holy Saturday. Holy Saturday is the pause between death and new life. It's a period of waiting and of stillness, where we imagine the disciples must have been wondering how this could have happened and what they ought to do next. It feels a lot like right now. In a time of pandemic, our new season of Holy Saturday invites us to re-examine the psalm that we read on Holy Saturday, Psalm 46, which says that the kingdoms are tottering and the earth is melting and desolations threaten everything. And the command is, be still and know that I am God. And the command could sound harsh, but it isn't a rebuke like, hey, be quiet. It's an invitation to hear the supernatural stillness of God. It means don't be afraid of what's next. And none of us would know what came next if it hadn't been for Mary Magdalene, who went to the tomb on that early morning and became the one who told everyone what had happened. Now, Mary goes to the tomb and she finds angels where she expected to find a corpse. And the angels are pretty observant and they can see the state that Mary's in. And so they say to her, why are you crying? Now, you can tell these angels missed the course in pastoral care and counseling at the Angel Seminary. Because the first thing you learn about people in grief is that you never ask, why are you crying? Why is a useless question. It's threatening, it's unsupportive, it's paralyzing and conversation stopping. And it's almost certain to make the person who's crying cry even more, because if they had a good answer to that question, they probably wouldn't be crying in the first place. And Mary, to her credit, doesn't say, well, that's not a very helpful question. What kind of angel are you? She says, they've taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have laid him. She still doesn't know what's going on. But what she could have easily said is, why am I crying? I'm crying because I'm staring into this horror show around me, and death right now seems to be obliterating everything I want and everything I know, and I feel powerless and fragile and alone. And so staring into the unknown, Mary cries. She cries for what was, for what could have been, and for the sheer senselessness of the whole thing. I wonder what you do when you stare into your own unknown. A lot of us are doing that now, wondering about a future that seemed like it would be one way, and now we're not sure what things look like going forward. What do you do when everything seems lost? Do you share some of Mary's tears? Now, we have a lot of resistance to answering the angel's question of why you're crying, but it's a question really for all of us because, like Mary, we've all had glimpses of how good and beautiful the world can be, only to turn a corner and remember how cruel and punishing it can be at the very same time. We know the joy of love and the terrible loneliness of grief. We know why she's crying. When Mary turns away from the tomb, having not gotten much change out of the angels, she begins another conversation, this time with a man she takes to be the gardener, but we realize to be someone else. Jesus asks Mary the same question the angels just asked. Why are you crying? Apparently, Jesus also missed the pastoral care class. But Jesus adds a second question. He says, "Who are you looking for?" Now, this is actually a good question. It's a good question to ask anyone, but it's an especially good question to ask Mary right this minute, because Mary is obviously looking for Jesus. But who is this Jesus she's searching for? Well, here's the crucial point, friends, because the story has shown us who Jesus is. We learn so much about who Jesus is from the Easter story. You see, Mary was crying because she was facing her own sense of loss in the face of death, her sense of her own fragility and vulnerability, her weakness and loneliness and powerlessness. And this is who Jesus is. He's the one who overcomes death, who transforms the fragile, the weak, the lonely, and the powerless. And looking into the tomb, Mary knows who she's looking for. Mary has also just seen how brutal the world can be, how cruel people can be, how fractured justice can be, and just how much the world can be torn apart at the seams. This is also a part of who Jesus is. Jesus is the one who dismantles all of that, the one who heals cruelty, who brings real justice, and who stitches back together relationships that have torn apart. Jesus is the one who reconciles all things and the whole creation back to himself. And looking into the tomb that morning, Mary knows just who to look for. And then Jesus says one word, Mary. Now, there are only a few things you should really say to people in moments of deep grief and fear, but the best is a simple acknowledgement that you are known and that even in your suffering, you're still you and you're not alone. Just a word or two to let you know that you're accompanied and received and understood. And that's exactly what Jesus does. Mary suddenly knows that she is recognized and that she is not alone and will never be alone again. In my own times of fear or grief or just being overwhelmed, this is the most helpful thing. Just a gentle, I'm right here with you, in whatever form that takes. And this is what Jesus offers to Mary. And her tears are transformed. She knows the voice that has promised to be with her forever. I imagine still probably tears, but joy takes over. When it seemed like everything was lost, suddenly Mary is found and Jesus is alive. And if Jesus has emerged from the tomb, that means he's not been destroyed by the grave, and she's blindsided by imagining what it's like to live beyond death, to put aside fear and grief and sorrow, and instead to weep tears of joy and peace. If Jesus is alive, it means he has dismantled sin, and she's dreaming of a world where conflict is healed, hatred is transformed, cruelty is turned to kindness, and anger is displaced by mercy. She's crying because if Jesus is looking at her, that means he's reunited us with God, and her disbelief is washed away in this tidal wave of grace. If we look at this week, this Holy Week, we see all that humans are capable of and all that we face in the world. We know now more than we have at other times that we can't say that terrible things won't happen. You see, in our Holy Week stories, it wasn't just that things looked bad. They were really, really bad. It didn't seem like everything was lost. Everything really was lost. And then suddenly, the characters in our story were surprised by grace and joy and new life that they hadn't seen coming. The story says that as the disciples ran to the tomb, because they had to double check Mary's testimony and see for themselves, it says they ran with fear and great joy. Fear and joy. These two emotions are at the heart of the Easter story. They are at the heart of the Bible. They are at the heart of the life of faith. Fear and joy run with us through life together as constant reminders of the cost and the promise of following Jesus. Fear and joy are at the center of everything we long for. One of my favorite preachers, Frederick Buechner, describes it this way. He says it's as though God says, here is your life and here is the world, and beautiful and terrible things will happen. Do not be afraid. I am with you. This is the promise of Easter, friends. In the world, beautiful and terrible things will happen. We are not left alone and we are never without hope. Like Jesus, when we did not expect him, calling us by name and letting us know, I'm right here with you. Whether we are running with fear or joy or both in this endless Holy Saturday, this great pause we find ourselves in, God is with us in the world even now. This world where terrible and beautiful things are happening, we can remember not to be afraid. Because though fear and joy may walk hand in hand, the truth of Easter that surpasses all the others is this, and I want you to lean in really close so you can hear the secret of that quiet Easter morning. Joy wins. The joy wins, friends. Amen.